Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I'm very happy to take a call on during the committee stages of this bill. And I listened very carefully to the Minister's contribution. I thought he made some interesting points, and I thank him for the clarifications that he made during that speech at the beginning of these committee stages. I would, of course, point out to him that questioning the numeracy skills of other members in a bill which he had to withdraw and then reintroduce because the numeracy in it was wrong probably wasn't such a good approach to opening the debate. However, I do accept what the government are trying to achieve. I think it would be wrong for us to come here and say that what the government are trying to achieve is wrong. In fact, it is what we're all wanting to achieve, which is actually to bring MPs' pay increases in line to everybody else. There is, of course, significant heat in the debate around the best way to do that. This, unfortunately, is not the best forum in which to tease those out because we simply don't have the time or access to the expertise in order to be able to weigh up and assess the various options before us so that we actually get a solution that works. I, for one, would very much like to hear from the Remuneration Authority, the people who have to actually implement this bill, because what we're doing is constructing a new set of criteria which they are going to have to go away and figure out how they're going to interpret and how they're going to implement, but we're not giving them the opportunity to come to us and say this is what this will actually mean in regards to our interpretation or their interpretation of the legislation that we are now passing. I don't think that's a good thing because I think it could mean that we get something at the end of this year or in a couple of months once they've issued a new determination that is not what we're anticipating in this bill. It's also quite conceivable that in a year or two's time they will be making determinations that we did not envisage as we passed this legislation. The only way that we can know those things is by actually getting them to come in and explain to us how they will interpret this, and unfortunately there is no opportunity for them to do so because this is being debated under urgency. I think it is very concerning that the government are dismissing what are quite legitimate concerns being raised both in Parliament and outside of Parliament about the linking of this to the average of public sector pay. Now, it is based on full-time equivalents, but there are some issues within that. Let's take, for example, the restructuring within the public service. If you take a bunch of government departments and amalgamate them together, what tends to happen is that the number of managers and people on higher salaries increase, because people who are going into managing a government department of several thousand employees typically want to be paid more than if they were going into managing a smaller government department with a couple of hundred employees. And we've seen significant reorganisation in the public sector over the last 6 or 7 years, and in fact there was a reorganisation under the previous government as well. And in almost all of the instances where government departments were amalgamated together, the number of employees earning six-figure salaries significantly increased. So what this means by linking to the average overall is we're not taking into account the fact that management salaries can increase significantly, while the salaries of those on modest incomes can stay the same or in real terms, in fact, can even go backwards. So we could be getting a pay rise while the vast bulk of people working in the public sector actually are staying the same or going backwards because the management salaries at the top end are going up, not just because they're getting big pay rises, but because the overall composition of the way the public service is structured is changing, and there are more managerial positions than there were previously because government departments are getting bigger as a result of what I think has been, in some cases, some quite useful rationalisation. There has, of course, been management creep as well. The number of management roles stepping up over, for example, that $100,000 a year threshold has actually increased quite significantly over the last 4 or 5 years, despite the wage constraint within the public service. What that means, of course, is that those who are on modest incomes, the vast bulk of people, are either staying relatively stagnant or going backwards. The pay rises in 2009, 2010 that the Minister mentioned in his contribution included some pay increases for teachers, nurses, people working in the other health professions, the police. And those, okay. So is the Minister saying that he thinks that there is not a single teacher in the country that should be paid more?
More than what? More than that?
No, the question is quite a simple question. Are teachers paid sufficiently or should they be paid more? So there's no answer from the government. The government thinks that every teacher and nurse and police person, is policeman or woman, Mr. Chair,
Chris Hipkins,
is paid perfectly sufficiently and should get no pay rise. And I think that is reflective of the attitude of the current government. Had no answer, dead silence when asked whether teachers or nurses or doctors or police should be paid any more. Absolutely no answer whatsoever. And that's a very good question that Ron Marks asked. How much are they actually going to get? They've got pay rounds coming on this year. And of course we know that the government wants to dampen down expectations around that, because having gone with next to no pay rises for the last 4 or 5 years, there are some expectations that in fact what Bill English promised them at the last election, bearing in mind that the National Party promised at the last election to raise average wages significantly, there's an expectation that in fact the government are going to deliver on that. Silly old public for believing what the National Party had to say. Of course, I do want to also note that 2 of those professions within the public sector, 2 of the largest of those, teachers and nurses, are dominated by women. And would we in fact be that willing to suppress their pay if they were male-dominated professions? Would they be doing better? Because we know overall men tend to do better and women's pay has been suppressed, and that's certainly been the case within the public sector. I want to just turn briefly to the supplementary order papers introduced by the Green Party before I finish this particular contribution. And I've had a chance to skim the SOPs that the Greens sent through. We didn't get them until this afternoon, and we didn't get the final versions until just recently. That's not the Green Party's fault. That is the government's fault for introducing this legislation late and actually only giving clarity around what we're actually going to be passing quite late. And so we haven't had a chance to go through those SOPs, to tease them out and to be able to test them in the way that we would like to if we were going to give our support to them. I absolutely accept that there's a very real possibility that the SOPs the Green Party are putting forward may be much better than what the bill is that we are debating. But we simply don't have the opportunity, given this urgency, to go through and tease that out and test that properly, and we would want to do that before we were willing to lend our support to them. So it is not a reflection of the fact that we don't agree necessarily with what's been drafted by the Greens. It's simply we don't have the opportunity to go through them and test them properly. And I absolutely appreciate the goodwill that the Green Party is showing in trying to come up with a solution that might actually deliver a better outcome than what the government are proposing with this legislation. So overall, I think it's important when we take away all the heat that we get back to the principle of what we're debating here. MPs' pay shouldn't be out of whack with every other New Zealander. Every New Zealander has had to tighten their belts over the last, every New Zealander except for those on the highest incomes, who generally have done pretty well over the last 4 or 5 years, but the vast bulk of working New Zealanders have had to tighten their belts over the last 4 or 5 years because of the economic climate and because their salaries haven't been increasing in the way that they would like to hope. But I actually think that there is an expectation amongst New Zealanders now that the national government were to be believed when they were promised significant salary and wage increases at the last election. Because it was in the National Party manifesto. Happy to go and print it off for those members on the other side who didn't read their own manifesto. New Zealanders expect to have some pay increases. And the government suppressing public sector wages for valuable public sector jobs, and we're not just talking about people who sit in offices in Wellington, we're talking about frontline people like teachers, nurses, doctors, police, people who work in the Defence Force, those roles that we think are they're absolutely frontline services, they are going to suffer if the government continue to suppress wages in the way they are. This should be a high-wage economy, not a low-wage economy. The current government's aspiration seems to be that they're quite happy for it to be a low-wage economy. I would love to see MP salaries going up in a few years' time because everybody else in New Zealand is doing so well. That should be the aspiration of the current government. That is not the aspiration of this government.